Okay, welcome to Their Democracy and Ours. My name is David Palumbo-Liu, and I'll be introducing the event and talking a little bit about its genesis, its main goals, and then I'll be handing the event over to Astra Taylor. The event is sponsored by Jacobin Magazine and Haymarket Books. Haymarket Books is a radical, independent, nonprofit book publisher based in Chicago. Among the many vital authors it has published are Angela Davis, Astra Taylor, Debt Collective, Arundhati Roy, Mark Lamont Hill, and Keeanga Yamata Taylor. Jacobin Magazine is a democratic socialist publication. It's out quarterly in print, so please subscribe and support their work. A link to get a $10 yearly subscription is in the event description on YouTube, and please press like and subscribe to their YouTube channel, which will allow this video feed to reach more people. So again, tonight's speakers are Angela Davis and Astra Taylor. Angela Y. Davis is the author of several books, including Women, Race, and Class, Are Prisons Obsolete, and Freedom is a Constant Struggle. She's the subject of the acclaimed documentary Free Angela and All Political Prisoners, and is Distinguished Professor Emerita at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Astra Taylor's writing and filmmaking are grounded in her work as an organizer. She co-founded the Debt Collective, a union for debtors, and co-authored the Debt Collective's new manifesto just out from Haymarket, Can't Pay, Won't Pay, The Case for Economic Disobedience and Debt Abolition. So how did this event come about, and what are some of its topics? More than a year ago, a class I teach at Stanford called Scholarship and Activism organized this event, and we very much wanted to hear from Astra Taylor, watch her film, and hear her thoughts on the film, and also have Angela Davis on stage with her to exchange ideas on two main topics, but we're going to, I'm sure, reach others tonight. But the two main topics were, first, what is democracy? How has it been manifested for good and bad? And what's the difference between a democracy that lives up to its name and its potential and one that simply borrows the name for the sake of altogether different purposes? Astra Taylor's book, Democracy May Not Exist, but We Will Miss It When It's Gone, and her film both capture many ways to address these questions from historical, conceptual, and activist perspectives. The second topic we wanted to foreground was, what kind of activism will it take to bring about our democracy? And in particular, how can different generations and different groups of people work together? I've had the privilege of knowing Angela Davis for some time now, and there are a million reasons why I would want her to be a part of this event, but the main reason I wanted to have her here is because of a remarkable lecture she gave in Pretoria, the Steve Biko Memorial Lecture, which was entitled Legacies and Unfinished Activisms. And in it, she gives probably the most inspiring and heartfelt and uplifting talk about precisely the idea of working together, different generations, different kinds of people, for a common purpose. Because the pandemic struck, we weren't able to have it in person, and we were looking for a sponsor. I write occasionally for Jacobin. I have a book coming up from Haymarket. And so I turned to Bhaskar and Anthony, and they very generously offered to take up the sponsorship and produce this show. So my heart goes out to them, as well as to Angela and Astra, who are going to spend the next few minutes going into this topic. And I want to thank you for being here. And with that, I'll hand things over to Astra.
Thank you so much, I want to also thank our hosts, Haymarket Books and Jacobin Magazine. And I really want to acknowledge you, David, and thank you for visioning this event and sticking with it despite all of the disruptions of the last 8 months. Of course, it's a huge honor to be speaking to Angela Davis. Everyone tuned in knows why. She's brilliant, she's brave, she's engaged. She embodies the title of that book we just saw, Freedom as a Constant Struggle, but also puts the joy, I think, in struggle, right? That it's not just struggle as duty, but struggle is something that gives us meaning and pleasure. So thank you, Angela, for being here. Our theme is democracy. And I guess I just want to begin by saying I didn't always like the word democracy. I came of age in the aughts under the War on Terror, and George W. Bush saying he was bringing democracy to the Middle East really shaped my perception. I was not interested in democracy. It sounded hollow, corrupt. I was interested in words like liberation, equality, socialism, communism, revolution, anything but democracy. And I began to rethink my ambivalence in 2011 when there was a wave of global movements, from the Arab Spring to the movement of the squares to Occupy Wall Street, which I was very involved in, demanding real democracy and saying this, in all these contexts, what we have isn't it. So almost 10 years later, my conviction now is that democracy is a concept that we need to struggle over, and that for all of its frustrating vagueness, and it's a hard word to define, it is also inherently radical. And that's why the powerful have always despised it, and why they have tried to co-opt it or limit our understanding and practice of it. So there are lots of ways to define democracy. Each one raises a lot of questions, a lot of conundrums, paradoxes. That's what I write about in my book, how democracy contains all these paradoxes. But broken down into its component parts, it means the demos, the people, have kratos, have power. And we can, and I think will, have to endlessly struggle over how we define the people and how we rule, how we hold that power. It's always open to debate, to contestation, and I think ultimately to expansion, radical expansion. Here's another way of defining democracy: rule of the poor. That was Aristotle's definition. He said democracy is always rule of the many, and the many are by definition not rich. So even in that basic understanding, democracy has a class component, right? And that's why the rich and the powerful prefer oligarchy, which is rule of the few. So a warning before we proceed: we're not going to spend a lot of time on the election, on the news. I endorse Angela's advice that she's given elsewhere on how to approach it. I think of voting less as something, as like voting for a candidate we love, and more as voting for an adversary I want to fight, or the political terrain I want to fight on. And I'd rather fight centrists than reactionaries. So we are going to expand democracy beyond just this limited conception of democracy as electoral politics, even though we will, of course, touch on that. So before I hand it to Angela, we're going to show a 2-minute clip from my film, What is Democracy? And in this movie, I wanted to hear from everyone. I went around and I spoke to philosophers, to politicians, to school children, to refugees, and tried to approach them as philosophical subjects and get their thoughts. I was in Miami in late 2015, and some of my friends were involved with the Dream Defenders that were sponsoring Angela's talk, and my visit just happened to coincide with it, so I ended up filming her lecture. So after the clip, I'd love for you, Angela, to pick up on some of the themes in it, and to pick up on this concept of abolition democracy, a title of another one of your books, and talk about what that means in this context of a historic election, but also, a bigger political crisis, a moment of unprecedented protest against police brutality, and a pandemic that has led to the deaths of over 200,000 people in this country, most of which, or many of which, were preventable and are a consequence of the contempt for human life and the greed that drives the current administration. So without further ado, let's play the clip.
Well, I haven't been to Miami in a long time. Let me say that. The first time I came to, I won't talk about the first time I came to Miami. I was running from the FBI the first time I came. We have to abolish rather than fix the system. The system cannot be fixed. I always like to go back to W.E.B. Du Bois and his notion of abolition. Because so many of the problems we're confronting are a direct consequence of the fact that slavery was never fully abolished. Du Bois argues that the abolition of slavery would not simply be the dismantling of the institution, but rather the creation of new conditions, new institutions, a new democracy. Because what he argued was that the democracy that we were all familiar with could not be the same if former slaves began to participate on a basis of equality. It would have to be a very different democracy, not the democracy of the founding white fathers. And so that challenge, that was the challenge of the end of the 19th century. It was the challenge of the 20th century. And it remains the challenge of the 21st century.
Wow, that was 2015. I think that we can learn a great deal from W.E.B. Du Bois about the nature of democracy. First of all, it's not a unitary term.
Mm-hmm.
Democracy is not the same across time, across space. And too often we think of democracy as one thing, rule of the people, rule of the majority. And it tends to assume an inside and outside. And so, therefore, so many struggles have been about bringing the marginalized, those who have been marginalized in relation to the existing democracy, into the fold of the democracy. And that is where we make many mistakes. And I think W.E.B. Du Bois, in emphasizing what abolitionists were evoking during that period, argued that the democracy could not remain the same and respond to the needs of those who had been previously enslaved. The democracy itself would have to be transformed. And as I said, new institutions would have to be created, ways of guaranteeing that, that the democracy could respond to the needs of a people who had been held in chains for so many decades. When we think of democracy as a unitary concept, as one thing, as unchangeable, and our goal is simply to bring more and more of the marginalized populations into the democracy, we fail to recognize that oftentimes it is the very structure of that democracy that has created the marginalization in the first place. And therefore, by simply including people, actually this is a critique of the strategies of diversity and inclusion. And these days, the assumption is that any institution that wants to join the struggle against racism simply has to create their office of diversity and inclusion, bring those in who were previously marginalized, but pay very little attention to the process of transforming and changing and rendering more just the actual structure that was responsible for the marginalization. So I think we have a great deal to learn from Du Bois and his notion of abolition democracy, which was never fulfilled, of course, in the aftermath of the so-called abolition of slavery, the negative abolition of slavery, the way in which the institution itself was prohibited. And I think that in the year 2020, we're faced with basically the same issues that Du Bois was writing about in Black Reconstruction. And we're doing, as I've said many times, we're actually now, it seems to me, preparing to do work which should have happened over 150 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it makes me think of James, the quote, I think, from James Baldwin, do I want to be integrated into a burning house, right? Or something to that effect, that we want to transform.
Said a sinking ship, and Jimmy said, yeah, a burning house.
Yeah, and you know, thinking too about the fires, the fires raging on the West Coast, and the burning being, you know, very literal right now in some places. That brings me, I mean, this is exactly, I think, what so many of us are wrestling with right now, is that there's a tension between participating in the system as it is, that a system that is so problematic, that disappoints us, that exploits us, you know, of course, at varying degrees, but is a deadly and destructive system, and but also wanting to keep our eye on a transformative horizon. So, you know, I want to go back. You talk about the democracy of the founding white fathers, and there's all the ways that the political system we are operating in, it was founded on so many exclusions, the exclusion of enslaved people, formerly enslaved people, women, men without property, and those exclusions still reverberate today. And we could talk about, you know, why they were so averse to democracy, why the founders abhorred democracy. They were interested in minority rights. They wanted to protect the rights of a minority, the opulent, they said, of landlords, of slaveholders. And the structures they devised are still with us and still constrain us. And it's frustrating, you know. And we could go on about all the ways our current system is very undemocratic, from the Supreme Court now promising to suppress any progressive legislation, to the Senate, and it goes on and on. So this tension, I guess I just want you to speak to this tension of operating within the system as it is, working towards an abolitionist horizon, this expansive horizon, but also I think being aware of the fact that progress that has been made can be rolled back. That's what Du Bois's work on Reconstruction teaches us, right? And we're seeing all sorts of attempts to roll back what limited political and civil rights people have. In a basic way, you can look at this voter suppression that's happening. I'm in North Carolina now. You can look at the disenfranchisement of felons. The state of Florida, you know, the public voted to reenfranchise former felons, and then the Republican legislature said, well, no, not if they have debts, court debts. We're not going to let them vote. So yeah, I'm just wondering if you could speak to operating within this tension, keeping all of those levels in mind. I guess one thing I'll say is I think that conservatives sort of do a better job, and I'm thinking about democracy in a very limited terms in terms of elections or political system, but of trying to alter the rules of the game. So not just trying to get inclusion, which is what, you know, progressives and liberals have been after, including ourselves, access to the ballot, but rewriting the actual rules by which you're included. And so, you know, I think we are frustrated by presidential elections every 4 years, but I think in the rest of the time, we do need to think about reforms that would change the rules of the game. So rather ranked choice voting, or, you know, ways to actually transform the system that might be actually achievable on some level if we're strategic, instead of just thinking about participation.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that if we simply look at democracy as a form of political rule, mm-hmm. We exclude a whole range of issues that really ought to be attended to in discussions regarding democracy. yeah, why is it that this myth of the U.S. as the first democracy, writ large, continues to command so much attention when, as we, pointed out, and as you said in the very beginning, it was actually what you might call a democracy of the minority, which ought to be oxymoronic when we think about the ways in which we think about democracy. What would be interesting would be to talk about the economic implications of democracy. What would an economic democracy entail? What about social dimensions of democracy? And how is democracy changed in relation to the particular economic system, which constitutes the foundation for that democracy? Of course, Marx talked about bourgeois democracy, and I think it's really important to retain some of that specificity that the democracies that we are accustomed to were democracies designed to guarantee political power from the middle classes, from the bourgeoisie, in relation to the old feudal system. So, what would it be like to imagine a democracy in which everyone got to participate on a basis of equality, economically, culturally, socially, politically? And I think it becomes much more difficult to come up with a kind of nice definition of democracy in that way. It becomes too complicated. If we argue that everyone, for example, by virtue of living in a particular region, should be considered a citizen and should be able to participate in the governing and the economies, what would that mean?
I love this line of questions. So I think, one, and this gets to what I was wanting to ask you and think about next, which is, the relationship of democracy to the economic system. And so, I two things, I guess. One is I've noticed, and I noticed this when I was going around and interviewing people for my film and interviewing conservatives, young conservatives in particular. I expected them to tell me how capitalism was democratic, right? And to speak, to use the rhetoric of democracy. What I found, especially in the days after Donald Trump won the 2016 election, was a self-conscious, a knowledge that they were actually never going to win majorities. And so there was this sense that democracy is bad. We depend on minoritarian institutions like the Electoral College, and forget that 20th century marriage of capitalism and democracy, that Cold War marriage. We're going to take the capitalism part, and we are going to be sort of self-consciously elite. And we see this now in the last week. A lot of prominent Republicans have tweeted, "Hey, we're not a democracy anyway," right? And reverting to actually this American tradition of being anti-democratic. Mm-hmm. And then I think on the other side, people are realizing that actually we need to marry socialism and democracy, that actually you need to have that economic underpinning, you need to have that economic equality, to have anything approaching even liberal democracy, to have liberal rights and freedoms that we're supposed to have, right? We actually don't even have them because there's so much inequality. So I think that, what you were getting at least, or what I heard was that, it's true that we need a different economic system But I don't think that solves all of our questions. And what I like to think about is how under socialism, under a communist horizon, a socialist horizon, all of these rich democratic conundrums would come to the fore, right? We'd suddenly have all these really thorny democratic problems. How do we actually share power? How do we live in a world where there's commonwealth, right? And not where things are provided in common, but we also want people to have control over their lives. And on, how do we decide who gets to make what decisions? So I think the democratic questions would actually just be much richer and more profound.
Well, I've also been questioning whether the outcome of the last election might have been different if more attention had been paid to those who are experiencing the impact of global capitalism, those poor white families who now recognize that their children are not going to be better off than they were. If we had developed strategies that would have permitted us to recognize that so many of the existing problems in this country are directly related to the rise and the spread of global capitalism. As a matter of fact, we used to have more economic democracy than we have today. It used to be that people could expect to be treated at any hospital if they were ill. Hospitals and the whole healthcare system had not been thoroughly privatized as it has been, which is one of the reasons why the COVID-19 pandemic has created such a state of emergency, particularly with respect to hospital beds, because empty hospital beds are not profitable. And so I think that if one looks at that, the impact of global capitalism, the way in which it is very much an explanation for the rise of the prison industrial complex, the disestablishment of so many of the institutions that used to serve as a safety net, economic safety net for people, the increasing privatization of education, the privatization of healthcare. And so the failure to develop more institutions devoted to the public good and the deterioration of those that existed have created a terrain in which poverty has expanded, not only among communities of color, Black, Brown, Indigenous communities, but also among white people. And the current occupant of the White House called upon those who were suffering the impact of global capitalism, suggesting false solutions, a return to another era, a return to an era in which the industrialized economy in this country responded to the needs of people. And that's not going to happen. All the jobs that have gone all over the world, particularly to the global south, are not going to return to the US. So I think it really is important to consider the ways in which economic transformations have a direct impact on possibilities for democracy.
Yes, I mean, and certainly, I was making the film right before the 2016 election. I talked to a lot of people who were very frustrated and, wanted to, basically, felt utterly hopeless, and for good reason. I mean, we know lots of research shows that regular people have basically no influence on public policy. One problem, right, is the dearth of unions and the tax on, and this brings me to another question I wanted to ask, which is just the history of actually of red baiting and attacks on the left and the role that has played in undermining democracy. So I think it speaks to what you were just laying out, right? The lack of unions, and they're not robust. The lack of associations where regular people can get a radical political education and be treated as thinking, active participants and think about the economy in a critical way. I've been reading labor history through this pandemic. That's been one of my pastimes. It's thinking about the Haymarket generation, for example, to speak to our hosts here, the Red Scare. I mean, I don't need to tell you about attack on the left in the 1960s. And those seem to be, certainly heating up with this administration. The way the Trump administration talks about Antifa and socialism and is sending troops to cities. And then occasionally, it sometimes seems too that liberal centrists would rather like lose to the right than let the left win. And so this demonization or criminalization or, of the left, I think has played a really powerful role in shaping American democracy as we know it. And I was just wondering if you could speak on that and maybe think about, what might be in store for us.
Yeah, and there, of course, contemporary efforts to evoke the red baiting of the past in the way in which the current occupant of the White House attempted to discredit the current Democratic vice presidential candidate by calling her a communist. Well, I won't comment on that, but I do think it's important in this conversation about democracy to recognize the role that socialists and communists have played in struggling for democracy in this country. I know that for decades, there were ways in which people in other countries who were involved in socialist and communist struggles referred to the other America. There was the America, represented, by the those in power, and then there were the unions. There were the struggles against racism, the struggles against sexism, and I think that you were saying that you've been reading a lot of history recently, and what we've lost in our historical accounts is precisely the role that communists and other socialists played in expanding the possibilities of democracy in this country. We have unemployment and insurance precisely as a consequence of the struggles in the 1930s. If one looks at the role that Black communists played in the South in creating the terrain for what eventually came to be known as the civil rights movement, that has basically been eradicated from mainstream representations of history. And as we are engaging in what people are calling a racial reckoning, I think that the terminology should be broader. It's not simply a racial reckoning. It's a reckoning with the history of this country, not only the history of racism and the history of class exploitation, but also the history of the resistance. And if we aren't aware of those whose struggles created democracy as an aspirational notion, not as a given set of affairs, not as a simply a way in which government is organized, but a struggle for a more just, more equal society. If we eradicate that from our history, then we have nowhere to start. We don't acknowledge the continuum on which our struggles unfold.
Right, exactly. And the idea that having a communist be the vice president would actually be part of this history of expanding democracy, not something to run away from.
Well, I was once a candidate of the Communist Party for vice president, so I can relate to that.
That's the world I want to live in, though, where you won. No, I think, I recommend this as a way to spend one's time reading this history, because, incredible, powerful fights that came before. And, I thought I knew it, and it turns out the more I read, the more I realize I didn't. How about reflecting a bit on the connection between incarceration and democracy? Because you are known, of course, for your work around prison abolition. And I do want to highlight that we're heading to an election where the fact of felon disenfranchisement in Florida may be what tips that state towards Republicans. That's what happened in 2000. We hear a lot about how the left lost that election, but you can make a much more compelling case, I think, that felon disenfranchisement was a problem there. But it's much deeper than that. It's a bigger thing. You've pointed out, that de Tocqueville's Democracy in America only came after he wrote a paper touring the nation's prison. So it's a foundational relationship, incarceration, liberal democracy. And you said something I just want to say here. You said in a talk, imprisonment is the negation that liberal democracy required as evidence of its existence. It's this constitutive negation. And in my book, I cite Aziz Rana, who wrote a book called The Two Faces of American Freedom, but it's a lot of scholars get at this basic epiphany, right? The fact that American democratic freedom was founded on the domination and dispossession, right? On the enslavement of African peoples, on the attempted genocide of indigenous peoples and theft of their land. So democracy has always, as long as we know it, has long been twinned with imperial conquest, with exclusion, with exploitation. And so I guess my question to you is, is this constitutive negation, or it's like this debasing dualism where I only know I'm free if you're unfree? Is it intrinsic to democracy, or just the version of democracy we're living in? Can we invent a different paradigm? And to what degree do we need actually prison abolition at the center of this democratic horizon that we're talking about?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's very interesting. Rolando Patterson's book on slavery and social death, in which he speculates that Western democracy, as we know it, must have evolved from the yearnings of the enslaved to be free. So the very concept of freedom then that we work with in many ways requires a sense of unfreedom in order to explain its emergence. And certainly, as you pointed out, slavery was the palpable evidence to those who were not enslaved that they were free. How do I know I am free? I know I am free because I'm not a slave. But of course, the emergence of prisons as punishment, in conjunction with the rise of the revolutionary ideals and emergence of democracy, imprisonment, punishment becomes the underbelly of democracy, and it's actually not conceivable outside of the context of democracy. As a matter of fact, you need democracy, capitalist democracy, in order to imagine imprisonment as a punishment. Because what does imprisonment entail? It entails the divestment of rights. And it would make no sense in a society that did not recognize individual rights. It would make no sense outside of the context of a democratic society. I mean, this is one of the reasons why the U.S. Leads the world in terms of the numbers of people imprisoned, incarcerated. Even countries like China and India that have huge populations cannot even begin to approach the number of people who are incarcerated. So I think it's really important to keep in mind that constitutive negation of democracy actually constructs. I mean, that's the whole point of the constitutive negation. It constructs a democracy, and therefore it has to be denied from those who are imprisoned. And I watched your film, and I was really moved. I was moved by so much, so many of the interviews I saw in the film. But I remember this young man, I guess it was in Florida, who was a barber, who had recently been released from a prison. And
Ellie, yeah.
And what was his name?
Ellie,
yeah. And I was so moved by the way in which he talked about education. And actually, this is kind of moving into another area, temporality and democracy. He said very casually, he said, it used to be that my people could be killed for trying to learn how to read and write. And I was struck by that, because we are encouraged to think of the human lifespan as the framework for what we do. And he just very casually talked about his people during slavery as if he could actually smell them and touch them, and it was a very small part of the film, but it made me think about the extent to which the capitalist democracy, bourgeois democracy, creates restricting and imprisoning temporalities, and our relationship to the past, our relationship to the future, is so restrained by the existing forms of democracy, and that if we are to imagine new modes of democracy, we would also have to generate new temporalities.
Oh, I love that so much. Ellie is, one of the wisest people in the film, I think. But the temporality question is really interesting, and I was thinking of bringing it up, but now that you have, I will. I mean, I think we rarely ask the question of what is democracy's relationship to time, and what I think is that in a portion of the past has a really heavy hand. If you think of the Constitution, it's these founding fathers, their hand reaching up from beyond the grave, and this hand, this handful of men still having an enormous say over our lives. And that I think in my book, I think I talk about G.K. Chesterton, who's a conservative critic, and he says, well, tradition is honoring the dead. We can't disenfranchise these esteemed men, but I think we need to expand democracy spatially to include, to have an internationalist horizon, but I think also temporally to include future generations, the people to come, and somehow make their presence palpable in our democracy. How do we ensure, a world for people who aren't yet here, not in the pat way of protecting unborn fetuses, but in a meaningful way of how do you ensure that there's a planet for the people who don't yet have a vote or a voice. So I think that the question of democracy and time is really, really interesting to me, and something that I think we actually really do have to think about. So, and the one thing I will say too on that front is I think inherited wealth is another way of the past having power over the present too, right? The accumulation of wealth from bygone generations weighing down on us today. So this time question is so fascinating. Democracy has to be feminist, for sure. I want to invite you to speak on the question, on the idea of abolition feminism. The film ends, right, with Silvia Federici, the socialist feminist, saying democracy in the home, democracy in the country, which I think points to the fact that we need to democratize, we need to think of democracy in terms of many spheres of life, not just this, political sphere that we pretend can be severed from the private sphere, but education, the economy, our relationships, and even ourselves. And social feminists like Federici and many others have thought about social reproduction. So the importance of social reproduction, which is also sometimes just, care work, the care for each other in our society. And I guess that's just really coming into relief for me as a democratic issue, as we find ourselves ruled by an administration that just seems so contemptuous of vulnerability, right? And that sees weakness, sickness, disability as just, something to be mocked, and really sort of is this literal. It's literally like toxic masculinity, and the fact that it just willfully spreads COVID because it refuses to be compassionate and wear a mask. But I just would love to hear your thoughts on feminism and democracy and the importance of care in a democratic society.
Well, it's a big question, and I suppose I would begin by arguing that our feminism should be much more capacious than it usually is. We generally assume that when the subject turns to feminism, that we're going to address issues of gender. And of course, we have to address issues of gender. But feminist approaches are so much broader than simply engaging with gender. We've learned how to think, to use Kimberly Crenshaw's term, intersectionally, which means that we've learned how to give expression to different connections and intersections and interrelationalities, whether they have to do with gender or not. And abolition feminism urges us to think about what might be required to begin to move in a democratic direction. That is to say, what might we need to dismantle? What might we need to cast into the dustbin of history? Police departments and prisons, privatized healthcare, etc. But also how we think differently about those struggles. So how would we think differently about? Let me use an example of gender violence. If we did not have to assume that the institutions of policing and imprisonment were not there to pretend to solve the problem. So we would have to take a much more complex approach. And this is what I appreciate about feminism, that it troubles our neat analyses. It makes us deal with a messy world. It makes us recognize that social realities don't always reflect the neatness of our analytical categories, and that we have to be willing to try to begin to approximate the messiness of social reality, and so that means that that when we say abolition And when we say abolish the police, abolish prisons as two institutions that need to be, as I said before, cast into the dustbin of history. How do we address the problems that these institutions pretended to address but could not? And also to address the personal is political, because the personal is always political. And as Sylvia Federici says in her conversation with you about the mural. But the personal is not political in a way that allows us to equate the personal and political. The political constructs the personal, and what we often assume to be ideas that have been generated by our own individualities. They are ideologies connected with the state. So a feminist approach would argue that we cannot achieve abolition without also recognizing that we have to adapt a critical stance to our own emotions and to our own ideas that we assume are our own, but they're often the ideas of the state that work through us. And so I think these feminist insights are absolutely essential when it comes to reimagining a democracy that would be more egalitarian and provide more justice for all.
Right, and when you're saying, or if I understand correctly too, the abolition of prisons necessitates the building of institutions of care and repair institutions. And so in that sense, addressing our needs, our emotional needs, and treating people in a very different way. But there will be a lot of care work to do when we're repairing the damage of the system, it seems to me.
And also that care work has been incorporated into activist work, mm-hmm. which is again, an instance that allows us to see the impact of feminism on, and when I say feminism, again, it's one of those terms like democracy.
Yeah.
People think they know exactly what feminism means, just as they think they know what democracy is. But I'm talking about a feminism that is anti-racist and that is anti-capitalist and all of those things, not just what we used to call bourgeois white feminism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and for me, feminism is an intellectual orientation. It's one of curiosity and listening and asking questions and not being the pontific. There's so many dimensions to that word, but all good words are complicated, and that's part of their beauty, I guess. I want to ask you a question about capaciousness, and this is the question I would say that's nearest to, sort of my sort of radical horizon, right? I want to talk to you about non-human animals. I think one thing this pandemic has done is made me feel like we have it's urgent that we bring this issue up, because COVID-19 is not a natural disaster. It's a zoonotic illness, as lots of pathogens are, and it jumps species because human beings, driven by capitalist imperatives, are devouring the natural world. We use 40% of the Earth's habitable surface for our food supplies. People who had been fishermen couldn't compete with the big trawlers, went into wilderness. The next pandemic will probably emerge from an American factory farm, whether it's swine flu or avian flu or a antibiotic-resistant superbug, because we cram hundreds of thousands of animals into these spaces. It's striking to me that Donald Trump used the Defense Production Act one time, and that was to keep meatpacking plants open, even against the objection of the workforce, who are mostly immigrant, very underpaid, exploited. And that was driven by greed, not need. We're talking about a huge industry here that, the risks of it are really becoming clear. There's the risk of these novel illnesses, and then there's the climate consequences of this method of farming too. So I wrote a piece with my sister, Astra Taylor, who's a disability rights activist, and we basically said, this moment calls on us to have solidarity across species. And I think there are epidemiological, ecological, economic, and ethical reasons for the left to question our relationship to animals, to question meat eating. I think socialists are quick to question private property in other spheres, but rarely ask, okay, well, what entitles us to treat animals as things, as property that we can exploit, and animals as creatures we can relentlessly dispossess. So it can seem very utopian, I think. It's to think about including non-human life in our democratic politics. But I think I personally just really strongly feel our lives depend on it, right? We're seeing that with the destruction of the environment, with these illnesses, which are increasing in number and virulence. And I think people will often say, okay, well, we need to prioritize humans, and as though solidarity is a kind of zero-sum game. And I guess I feel that we have to reject that and expand the circle of concern. And I just would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. I completely agree with you. The prioritizing of humans also leads to restrictive definitions of who counts as human. And the brutalization of animals is related very much to the brutalization of human animals. So I think that this will be a very important arena of struggle during the coming period. The industrial production of food that racial capitalism has generated, and I think that I think that our eating habits, which reflect more than our own proclivities, that our eating habits reflect the production of food that is governed by racial capitalism. And I think that when we think about struggles for freedom and struggles for democracy, the actual issues have transformed over time. And one of the reasons why I think this sense of the kind of temporalities that encourage more expansiveness and more capacious democracy are also related very much to the way non-human animals and the flora of the earth figure into our frame. The colonization of the planet by Monsanto has created damage that is inconceivable. And if we are to engage in ongoing struggles for freedom and democracy, we have to recognize that the issues will become ever more expansive, because initially, right, the question of democracy only addressed a small subset of white men, white affluent men. And then because of labor struggles, perhaps, working class men, and struggles for women, gender struggles. So, I'm not suggesting that this is automatic, this trajectory of history, but what we have witnessed has been an ever expansive notion about the nature of democracy. And I do not see how we can exclude our non-human companions with whom we share this planet and I don't see how we can exclude the flora. Look at, I did a webinar earlier on during the pandemic with people in the Amazonas in Brazil, and they're having to address, not only the issues of racism as they affect indigenous people and Black people, but also the burning of the Amazon, and this makes me want to suggest that in these conversations and in these efforts to broaden our notion of what the possibilities of democracy are in the future, we have to avoid narrow approaches. We have to work against the blinder syndrome, which means that we can't only think about people in this country. During one of the other questions you asked me, I wanted to make the point, which I never got around to make because I moved in another direction. But as far as the vote is concerned, immigrants who live in this country ought to be able to vote. Because they are a part of the community, and so we will also have to address the obsolescence of the nation state. So I'm thinking about issues that will more than likely come up in the future. I don't know whether I will be around when they become mainstream. I did not think I would be able to witness the mainstreaming of abolition and the entrance of the vocabularies of abolition into mainstream discourse. But here we are.
Well, that's exactly what I wanted to talk to you about as the final question. I do want to say that for all the exclusions in American democracy, there was a long period when there was what was called alien suffrage, when actually voting rights weren't contingent on your citizenship. So that's a demand. There's precedent for that. And there are some municipalities where there's residency is all that's required for voting. There are other countries where you don't need to be a citizen. Decoupling democratic rights from citizenship, I think, is something that we should be talking about all the time. It's something that, it's there in our track record and should be at the fore. I think, right? What community are you a part of? Where do you live? Not this arbitrary thing of what passport do you hold?
And in some states, people in prison used to be able to vote. Actually, incarcerated people.
Yeah, and candidates would have to go visit the prison, and so I think these are sometimes our imagination is close to just things that actually have existed before. So I love this vision of democracy as this expanding circle, and what it conjures for me is people looking back on us and thinking, oh, wow, they lived in the democratic dark ages, so I want to.
And that circle changes for everyone. It doesn't remain the same. It doesn't simply become larger.
Right.
Its qualities are transformed as well.
Interesting. Yes. Right. It's not just an expansive thing, but actually the nature of it changes. And I think you're right about being bigger. I mean, we never look back on history and go, "Gosh, there was just too much solidarity. What a mistake." Right. That's never the regret. So. Yeah, I want to think about this democratic horizon. This is where I want to end. And the work of, I'm very concerned with building power. So that's why I have been involved in the Debt Collective, which is a union for debtors. We need economic material power. But there's an imaginative part of this, right? There's the democracy. It requires these imaginative leaps, getting new ideas out there. We've been trying to normalize the demand for debt abolition, for student debt cancellation, and free college. We've made some progress, but you've done an amazing, along with critical resistance and I'm sure innumerable comrades, getting this radical concept of prison abolition into the mainstream. And so I want you to say a little bit about what that feels like. And one thing you said in this amazing lecture that David pointed out to, you talked about how sometimes organizers, as they become veterans, start to close their minds to new ideas from younger generations, right? They want that process to stop. No more new ideas, no more expansion. And so I just was wondering if you could talk about, your openness. I mean, you are so remarkable in your openness to emerging organizers and activists, your willingness to learn from them, and maybe give some tips on how to be a good mentor, and how to welcome the challenges from future generations of organizers who are going to push beyond what we can see here and now.
Well, to keep my answer within the frame of this discussion of democracy, I think I would say that mentorship has to be egalitarian. Excuse me. That we challenge hierarchies, including hierarchies that are often seem to be set in stone, such as those that guarantee the elder more power and influence by virtue of age, and those that command the younger generation to follow in the footsteps of the older. I think that it's that it should be more egalitarian, and I think this is one of the ways in which we can enact democratic relationships in the course of struggling for change, not only in relation to, in the relationality of generations, but also in relation to for example, those who are in prison and those who are outside. Oftentimes, those who inhabit the so-called free world assume that they have a greater capacity to give leadership than those who are imprisoned inside. And I'm really thankful to Critical Resistance because from the very outset, the organization insisted on bringing those who were actually in prison into the leadership. And as a matter of fact, at the conference that we held in 1998, we insisted that prisoners participate in as many, I should say, people in prison rather than prisoners, because there's been a focus on language and how that affects us as well. But we insisted that the members of the panel, the various panels at the conference, had to include people who were in prison, which, technically it was challenging because we had to set up telephones and telephone numbers so that people could call from the inside and collect. But it was quite incredible. It was amazing to feel as if we were in community with those who were locked up inside, and that we were willing to take their leadership and that their ideas would be given equal weight as the ideas of a Stanford University senior professor. And I don't think that we have enough occasions to engage in that kind of prefigurative democracy, creating democracy as we struggle for democracy. But I think that is also a feminist approach that helps us to not only imagine a new world, but to become worthy of participating in that world, in the in the course of struggling for it.
Brilliant. That's such a wonderful answer. And I think in the spirit of democracy, we will now take some questions from the audience with Bhaskar helping us out. Thank you so much for that conversation, Angela.
Absolutely. And thank you. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, I was leaning in. I wasn't fully ready for my cue. So if you just saw my face really close, then, sorry. So I'll just give a couple questions from the audience. I know we're running a little bit late, but it's been a wonderful conversation so far. And I want to thank you both for all of your time. Then one last thank you to our comrades at Haymarket Books, to John and Anthony. I've known the people at Haymarket for at least a decade. They're the hardest working people in book publishing because they're motivated by ideology in the best sense of the world. And their ideology is a radical democratic egalitarianism. It's a socialism that I think really comes through in everything they publish. So anyway, cheers to Haymarket. So let's start with one question from Jules. So I'm paraphrasing here, but Jules wants to know what inspires Dr. Davis about the major social movement of our day, Black Lives Matter, but also where it might stand to learn lessons from the experience of the New Left and the social movement struggles of the 1960s for a more egalitarian society. So I guess we could start with that one.
Well, that movement is so exciting. I can remember. It doesn't seem like it was 2014 was how many years ago? 6 years ago. The Ferguson protests and the emergence of Black Lives Matter that had an impact not only all over the country but all over the world. And then more recently, of course, during the pandemic and the kind of collective grasping of the meaning of the term Black Lives Matter, which previously had been so often misinterpreted as meaning all lives matter. And of course, this the tyranny of the universal, as I like to call it, was a way of discounting the impact and import of looking at the very particular experiences of Black people in this country and arguing that Black lives should matter, and that only when Black lives matter will all lives matter. So I've learned so much from the three women who founded the Black Lives Matter Network, the Movement for Black Lives. I'm on the board of the Dream Defenders. And I think my mentors during this period have precisely been the young people who have taken up the struggles of the past and have given them so much more substance, it inspires me because I see that there is a generation that takes for granted what we struggle so long and so hard to figure out how to even articulate. And they not only know how to articulate it, but they know how to expand it and to develop ways of transforming the world that are truly inspirational. I think our role is basically to prevent the younger generation from making the same mistakes that we did. I think mistakes need to be made, and I always point out that oftentimes we learn so much more from our mistakes than we do from what we did correctly. And that the younger generation has to be permitted to experiment and to not do it correctly in the course of trying to figure out, how one builds movements. What is the language that appeals to people? How can we persuade people that even though we are living in a world that is made by capitalism, by racial capitalism, and that oftentimes our dreams are even constructed in accordance with capitalism, how do we nevertheless create a critical response? How do we encourage people and movements and organizations to recognize that ultimately we are going to have to dismantle this system and move in a socialist direction?
Well, there's a question from that in the chat that I think flows from it from Erica, which is, are we missing something as far as organization? So when we think about what sustained the generations from the old left to the new left and beyond, often they were too rigidly tight democratic centralist organizations, but there was some sense of membership and debate about program and the ability to take the energies of activists and kind of direct it and channel it into organizational vehicles. It seems like obviously we see the growth of several organizations on the left. I'm a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, but it seems like we're far more diffuse now, which obviously has some benefits to it. But I guess can you comment on whether there's anything we've lost and should try to find again?
Yeah, that would be a very long conversation. I can talk about a range of things, but I think I'll focus for the moment on internationalism. I was a member of the Communist Party. This is actually how my troubles started when I was fired from my first job because of my membership in the Communist Party. But I tell you that, sometimes I wonder why we have not been able to create that sense of connectedness, that sense of emotional connection with people in other places and other parts of the world. Why is it that Black women who are moving to the fore in this country are not more connected to the Black women's movement in Brazil? I continually remind myself that there is so much that we can learn from the struggles of Black women in Brazil. Not only women like Marielle Franco, who was assassinated, or Erica Malanguinho, who is the first Black trans woman to be elected to a state parliament in Brazil, but the histories of Black feminism that are so much a part of Brazil, largely because of the power of the impact of African religions, Candomblé and other religions that highlighted the power of women. So I'm yearning for the kind of internationalism that make us feel strong, that make us recognize that our desires are desires that animate people all over the world, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, in Europe, in Australia. So if I were to ask, what I would like to see now, that would be my answer. And I'm not suggesting that there is no internationalism, because obviously the part played by Palestine, for example, in pointing the way to our abolitionist struggles in this country has been so essential. The fact that abolition simply isn't about getting rid of prisons, but it's about the whole carceral regime, and we see in occupied Palestine the way in which carcerality characterizes the ways in which people are controlled in the community, and we have to be aware of that. So I want internationalism now.
Can I just say, though, I do think, I 100% agree. I also think that the commenter just is right, that we need organizations. We need to be organized. And, going back to the question about the suppression of the left, I think there's a reason, there's a reason why we don't have a lot of strong, robust, radical left institutions. And we have to reinvent those for this moment. And, we have to, I think, especially build associations focused on economic power. That's why I've devoted so much energy to figuring out how to organize debtors, because we live in a financialized economy. We are forced into debt for education, healthcare, our own imprisonment, our own incarceration, and this debt is someone else's asset. It's a leverage. It's a leverage we can wield, but also new forms of labor organizing gig workers, and we have common enemies that connect us internationally. If Uber drivers held a global strike because these companies are now multinational corporations. The financial entities that we're in hock to are also often global entities. Our communities are indebted to Goldman Sachs. Whether we're talking about people in Greece or people in the United States. So I think, but organizations is really key, and we need to invest in them, and we need to experiment and make them.
And on the question of internationalism, when I even think about a relative low period in the U.S. left in the 1980s, that was still a period of tremendous solidarity with the struggles in Central America, with the struggle in Grenada, a struggle I know that you were involved with, Angela, and it's been virtually forgotten, but was really the most incredible thing to happen in the English-speaking Caribbean, in its history as far as an emancipatory moment, and of course, the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. So there's a question which is another difficult one, but maybe this is a good place to actually, we'll do one more after this one, so we won't end on this one. But there's a question: is it possible to have a democracy under a capitalist system? If so, what mechanism do you think we have to actually achieve a real democracy instead of the theater of electoral politics? So I do apologize. I think it's a good question, but it's so broad that it encompasses basically the entirety of this talk. So you could pick any particular part of that. But obviously, there is a tension between democracy and capitalism, as you both have been talking about. But then there's also that step of wanting a deeper democracy than just electoral politics. And sometimes it's a bit easy to say, well, under socialism, we'll have real democracy, we'll have workplace democracy. And I guess people are wondering, is there an intermediary step? Is there some forms of democracy that we could create and enrich kind of before the revolution?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is what we should be doing. And I think I referred to a kind of enacting of democracy in the course of our engagements, intellectual engagements, activist engagements. And I'm thinking that academics most often tend to imagine themselves as solitary individuals who are engaged in labor that is individual or individualistic. So what would it mean to reconceptualize intellectual labor? What would it mean to develop a more collaborative notion of research and analysis. I love Stuart Hall because he so insisted on transforming intellectual work into democratic labor. And there's so many other examples that I could give. As we struggle for vast changes, we also engage in the process of bringing about changes in our lives, and this is, of course, the feminist dimension as well.
Yeah, I guess, I have an post-capitalist horizon as my ideal for democracy, but I would emphasize democratization. It's not, something that just doesn't exist, or it exists in some perfect form that's frozen in time forever. So, the theater of electoral politics, yes, it is a spectacle, but there are ways to engage it that are meaningful. I think I'm very heartened by socialists engaging at the primary level and realizing that those are actually some of the only competitive elections because of the way our districts are run. It's often preordained that a Republican or a Democrat will win. And so that's where you can intervene and have socialist candidates who then can win and shake things up. So, look for the spaces where there's more substantial engagement. And then, I think there are lots of places where we can prefigure our democratic practices. And that means like experimenting. I don't really know what that even means. I mean, part of my trajectory of learning and thinking about democracy was a response to Occupy Wall Street and the insistence on direct democracy, which I didn't think worked, but it got me thinking, it got me engaging. And, now I do a lot of my day-to-day democratic deliberating and struggling with the Debt Collective as we try to build this new institution and demand the abolition of these immoral and unjust debts and the provision of public services that we are entitled to. So I think, it's that process of experimenting and trying to even figure out what we mean when we say we want to have democracy in the here and now. I think to the organization question, just because I brought up the Debt Collective, I think to that question of democratic centralism, I think sometimes doing the work, respecting that people don't have a lot of free time. They don't have time for freedom to be an endless meeting, democracy to be an endless meeting. So things you can do where you are able to provide strategic resources, to create modes of engagement that are actually worth people's time and are respectful of their busy lives, and that have a chance of having some sort of transformative payoff, whether it's a psychic transformation, like I'm no longer ashamed of the fact I'm indebted and exploited, I'm angry, that's a benefit, or even, getting money back in people's pockets. I mean, there has to be, not everybody is as motivated as some of us who are, born activists to be doing the work every day. We have to also entice people and give them some reward or the possibility of it.
We need politics that can deliver the goods, and of course, consciousness isn't a linear thing. There are years in which people who previously might have been so-called apathetic, at least that's what the academic literature would call them, then realize that politics can in fact change their lives and change it for the better. And obviously, we're working at Jacobin, our colleagues at Haymarket are doing that. These two great thinkers are doing it in their work, trying to lay the terrain for that kind of work, that kind of emancipation, which will obviously come from working people themselves. So I think that's a great place to end it. Please, for everyone watching, press like. That's how we'll get the video to more people. Thanks again to everyone involved in putting on this event, for giving their time. And thanks to Connor Gillies for running the show behind the scenes at the technical level. And yeah, thanks again. I appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone.
you.